If we inspect our web page from the previous section, we'll notice something interesting. And that interesting observation is that by default, our template was appended as a child of the element that invoked our directive. There's nothing inherently wrong with this, but it may be preferred for the sake of keeping our DOM cleaner to replace the invoking element altogether. Let's go back into our directive and see what property we might be able to configure in our directive object to see how we might replace the invoking element with the template altogether. And it turns out that setting the replace property of our directive to true does the trick. Let's go back to our web page and see this in action. After refreshing the page, we see that our template now replaced the invoking element just as we wanted. One more thing that might be of concern to us is that currently our directive can be invoked by an element regardless of if the directive name is added as an attribute or an element. Perhaps we want to restrict that to only allowing it to be added as an attribute. How might we do this in our directive object? Well, we can simply add the restrict property and set it to A. A means that we restrict our directive to only being invoked by elements that use it as an attribute, and E means that we restrict our directive to only being able to be invoked by elements that set it as an element name. If we'd like, we could add both E and A, but those are the only two options. In previous versions of Angular, they allowed more options, things like comments and classes, but they got rid of those as of later versions of Angular. Let's go back to our web page to see how this restriction affects our directive calls. And after refreshing the page, we see that only one of our directive invocations worked. And that one that worked was the one where we added it as an attribute. Because we restricted it to A, it doesn't allow us to invoke that directive via an element name.